Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Monica Brady-Myerov, author of Listen Wise, Teach Students to be Better Listeners, and a former public radio reporter. I want to thank you all for joining us today and for this webinar about strategies for your English learners using audio. I was supposed to be joined by Professor Jeff Zwiers of Stanford University, but there's been an unexpected emergency, so he's unable to be with me today. So I apologize for that. I will be able to present his material and the strategies that we're going to learn today. And what we are planning to do is, when available, Jeff and I will re-record this webinar and send everyone the updated link. So we are recording this today, and we will get you the link of the one where we will have Jeff with us. And you'll still be eligible for your credits for attending this webinar. And as I said, I will be covering all of the same material as best as possible in his stead. So just wanted to make sure that you are aware of that and know that unfortunately Dr. Zweirs cannot be with us today. Again, a little bit more about me. I was a 20-year veteran of public radio, primarily with NPR and NPR member stations. I was a creator of audio stories, and I just fell in love with audio and the power that it has to teach language and content, especially around helping early readers and language learners learn academic language listening to audio. And this led me on a journey to discover even more about how audio can be used in education. And I started a company called Listen Wise that curates podcasts for the classroom in grades 2 through 12, which I'll be sharing a little bit about with you. But it also led me to write a book about how you can teach your students to be better listeners, and especially has a whole chapter on English learners and how using audio with ELs can accelerate their learning and improve their outcomes. And I'm going to be sharing a lot of that research with you today. You will be eligible to win that book just by attending today. So we have your information. Thank you for being here. And today we hope that you'll be learning more about this research on learning language and listening. And we're also going to be going over many, many practical strategies to build active listening skills in your students, improve their critical thinking, and especially get their conversation skills going. That's what Dr. Zweirs is most known for, about communications and academic language conversations. And we're going to learn about how using listening to kick off a conversation can be critical in terms of helping your students stretch their vocabulary and improve their speaking skills. So the resources and strategies shared in this webinar integrate grade level rigor, and they will simultaneously develop content knowledge, language, and literacy skills. So get ready for some practical strategies. Now, at any time, go into the Q&A or the team chat. The Q&A if you have a question, because we'll have time for those at the end. And the team chat if you want to share anything about where you're coming from. What grade are you teaching? What are your challenges and struggles? What are the things you're facing that you would love to hear more strategies on? Because to begin with, I want to just recognize that all the challenges that you have to overcome in working with English learners, often things that are assessed, teachers aren't even trained enough on how to teach. And listening skills ranks right up there. All language learning tests for ELs include it. In many states, it equals 25% of the outcome. And yet, teaching listening as a skill of how you can practice it and build on it is not typically part of your curriculum. Instead, there's a lot of memorization for tests, and that doesn't always stick in terms of excellent results on tests and lifelong learners. There's also the challenge of reading comprehension that you're facing with all levels of ELs, and we're going to talk a lot about how listening can play into improving reading comprehension. And then finally, just engagement and agency. You know, this global pandemic has taught us nothing but that we need to be even more engaging with the resources we offer our students if we want them to be involved. And I just saw that Dr. Zwiers has been able to join us. Jeff, I said you had an unexpected emergency and that you would hopefully be here. And if not, we'd take it from the top another time. But I'm happy to see you.
Sorry, I just had some connection issues, so.
Not a problem. Not a problem. We just got underway.
Okay.
Let me take a moment then to sort of backtrack and introduce my co-presenter, who's author and senior researcher, Dr. Jeff Zwiers from Stanford Graduate School of Education. And Jeff, we're really only on the first, introductory slide about all the challenges that English learning EL teachers face. And I was getting down to that idea of engagement and agency and how, especially in the pandemic, we've really lost so much of that. Our ELs have become disengaged. And I'm wondering, what you're hearing about this challenge and how some of the teachers, or what's your strategy for helping to overcome it?
Yeah, I mean, as you can see by that list, and there's probably even more that you could add to it. The funny thing is we've never gone through a year where just kids have, been on computers for learning. And so I think even now we still haven't quite grasped, we don't have the tools necessarily to figure it all out, right? There's the term learning loss, and there's also a lot of, lack of practice engaging with, kids and kids, right? Kid to kid practice. And so that kind of thing is, it's like when you think about, we don't know. We don't know exactly how much was lost in terms of social skill, in terms of, in terms of language development, in terms of the just kind of the social and emotional factors. We just don't know, right? And so that's what we're still figuring out. But what we do know is that, we have to kind of ramp back up and make up for lost time in some way.
Great, thanks. So let's start out then by talking a little bit about the research on learning language and listening. This is an area that, I think we can start off, by sort of defining sort of setting the stage about talking about what exactly do we mean by language used for academic purposes, Jeff?
Well, as you can see by this kind of somewhat hierarchical thing with these images, what we're really looking at is how do students both get communicated to and communicate in order to build up academic ideas and to make academic arguments. And so all of those aspects, we know what those are, right? Putting words together, organizing them, organizing sentences, and then also when it's face-to-face, especially, or when it's oral, the kind of how you emphasize certain words and the stresses and the intonation that you use. But all of that contributes to communication. And I think that's one thing that we're looking at. One of the emphases on in this hour is how do we help kids to communicate? And part of that, again, that communication is incoming. How do we help them to process, listen to language, and which also overlaps with reading? How do we help that authentic communication rather than just kind of the memorizing? Oh, let's memorize 10 vocabulary words, right? That doesn't do much for kids, unless it's kind of connected to them building something up in their heads or helping others build something up.
Yeah, and I think that when you think about it that way, that individual memorization, it makes me think about how that's not building the right blocks for language acquisition. And you put these two photos on here, which I think is really illustrative of the difference between that rote memorization of a word and versus using it in a context, right?
Yeah, exactly. You can kind of see the image. They're kind of extreme, but instead of just piling up bricks, which would be pieces of language, vocabulary, even grammar rules, instead of just piling them up, that we really want kids to be able to build, right? And to build things with those bricks, and to build up a nice something that lasts, right? A pile of bricks doesn't really last, but a house that whatever that is something that is, that could last hundreds and hundreds of years, right? And so, and you look at the quotation on the top there, it's, multilingual learners develop content and language, and all learners really develop language and content concurrently, and the academic content is the context for the language learning and the language as a means for learning academic content. And that's, it's very powerful it's really hard to memorize stuff, as we know. Just straight memorization of things, it doesn't last very long unless it's connected to something.
Right, and that in-depth understanding of content concepts, and the practice get pushed aside. So, and that's so key in terms of just learning how to read and becoming a good fluent reader. And listening is so integral to all of this because it's a prerequisite skill for reading comprehension. Not only is listening to audio an engaging medium, since storytelling is such a great way to learn, but listening builds literacy skills. And I talk more about this in my book because I go back even to like the prehistoric times. The first pedagogy was storytelling in terms of how we were learning. So podcasts, listening comprehension is just a fundamental building block of reading comprehension development, as we can see in this simple view of reading by Goff and Tumner, which suggests that reading is a function of two key components, decoding and language comprehension. And that if we really focus on the language comprehension part of it, that's where listening plays a big role. And it's made up of vocabulary, hearing new vocabulary words, building background knowledge for subjects your students may not know, but they could listen to and get information about, and syntax exposure. So what are the challenges to building these listening comprehension skills? That's where it gets more difficult, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's when you look at that list right there, a lot of times they're not assessed. There's teachers especially, we don't get a lot of training in your teacher ed program on listening. You just kind of expect kids to listen, and you don't really break it down. There's a lot of work on reading, right? There's a lot of work on teaching reading, particularly in the arena of phonemic awareness and phonics, but there isn't as much in listening, which happens even more often during your life, and so I think that there needs to be kind of an upgrading or even some extra work, at least in teacher ed or in professional development, on teaching of listening. It's complex. It's especially for listening to complex messages. It can be as complex or as challenging as reading, and with listening, you often can't. With technology, you can stop and rewind, but often if you're listening live to people, you're not going to say, "Oh, you're not going to continue to say, "Okay, can you stop, rewind, and I want to listen to that again." Whereas in reading, you can kind of stop and jump back, a paragraph or two. And then, of course, it's hard to kind of, get a handle on it in real time. It's hard to rewind. It's hard to go back. It's hard to, and there's a lot of thinking going on. There's a lot of processing. When you hear, let's say a long, even a short, 4 to 5 minute excerpt that's on an academic topic, it's hard to remember the stuff you need to remember.
Yeah. I'm curious if anybody here has been trained on listening. Put it in the chat. I'd be curious to know who's actually been trained on building listening skills. The research I've read says that we listen to the equivalent of a book a day. And we learn 80% of what we know from listening. And that's listening every day. Like if you think about even just going about your day and you learn what time the class ends or what time you're due at work, that so much of it is built on that listening, cognition, and understanding, that it is a skill that really does need some more, it's more complex than we realize. Mm-hmm. And what's going on neurologically too is pretty complex too, because it's involving so many more parts of your brain at once to build a movie in your mind when you're listening. Whereas often when you're reading and you're decoding, your eyes are decoding, your brain is spending a lot of effort just figuring out the words and not engaging as much the rest of the processes as you would in listening, because it's a little more, there's not as many barriers, right, to listening. It's just coming directly in. Mm-hmm. What's amazing to me is that even with all this research, and there's so much that shows how listening comprehension, improves reading comprehension, and the relative importance of listening comprehension, it actually increases over time because it takes until middle school to reach the point where reading comprehension outpaces listening comprehension. Now, this is for all students, and yet we don't, following the third or fourth grade, maybe we do very little listening in our K-12 instruction. And yet one study indicates that students, as they get older, problems with reading comprehension emerge. We know that. And there could be this huge opportunity to provide content as a listening comprehension with listening. And we can use audio to introduce higher level vocabulary words, stretch students' abilities, and introduce them to words that they may not know. So we can be helpful in increasing their academic vocabulary words. So all of this sort of makes it, I think, even more important to think about how you can be using listening more in your classroom to help your ELs and your struggling readers and all students, because again, this graph is not directed for ELs, it's for all students. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The other point I'll make is that research shows listening while reading helps students recognize letters and sounds, learn new words, become better listeners. So this idea of always pairing the text and the audio is like a research demonstrated improvement for comprehension. You can improve comprehension by 76%. So, Jeff, I've heard you say that when you're listening, you're not burdened by the decoding process, right? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, normally after the first three grades, your brain becomes so fluent in using phonics, using the letters, but before that, and even
we have somebody who's still on. Sorry, let me interrupt you, Jeff, and just say I think we need someone to mute as we can hear a young child.
I hear people. I'm okay.
Yeah, I think it's. I'm going to call out to Joe. Please mute yourself. Okay, hopefully she heard that. And carry on, Jeff.
Okay. And so it's, especially when you watch younger kids read, and then kids who are, learning, in general, learning English reading, there's a lot of brain power used on just figuring out, okay, what letter does this sound make? And then what is this word that these sounds together make? And so that takes a lot of energy. Little by little, just like other things that we do, little by little, we get used to it. But there's still, in those initial 3 years or so, there's a lot of work. The nice thing about listening all the way through is that you're really building up that. You're building up those words. You're building up most of what language is. You're not necessarily building up the phonics. You are building up some phonemic awareness because you do hear a wide range of people using different sounds and different ways of saying words, and you're learning the prosody. You're learning most of what language is through the listening, and it's very efficient. Like you said, we're listening to maybe not the equivalent of the content of a book a day, but the amount of language that we hear a day is powerful, right? And so that's why so many kids, if they're listening to a lot of academic or school-like texts, stories, nonfiction, family talking, then they often are more ready to read those, similar kind of academic or school texts.
And there's one researcher I like to highlight who found that it doesn't have to be in the home that you're hearing this. And we know that students who are with first language speakers at home and hearing exposure to that kind of rich vocabulary have an advantage with the number of vocabulary words and the reading level, and that ELs often don't. Well, there was this researcher in India named Birj Kothari who was the first to document this reading and listening together and how it could improve comprehension. And the reason why I have a Bollywood film picture on here is because he saw it when Indians were watching Bollywood movies with closed caption. So they were getting incidental exposure to reading. And he discovered that captions while listening contributed to word recognition and word comprehension skills. And in a country that has a large population of semi-literate and literate people, this made a huge impact. And now, today, it's implemented on many Bollywood films because of his research. And there was one study at an Indian primary school that even found 10 to 15% of children typically would not have read at a grade 5 level text were able to read it after 2 years of watching films with this subtitle. So subtitling the video or the audio and pairing it together is a research proven approach to improving comprehension with listening. Let me talk a little bit about now sort of that podcast idea and how to teach with podcasts and how that can support a variety of instructional goals. We've been talking primarily now about language, but it is a demonstrated, it's an approach that you can take with many different ways. You can connect learning to the real world, meaning using stories that are on ListenWise and which has daily current events. Playing a story about what's happening in the world gets students talking about it relating to what they're learning. You can then discuss contemporary ideas through a debate topic. And podcasts then can help you set up that debate. And you can also be able to build on academic ideas and languages we've been discussing and practice for performance tests, because there are quizzes on ListenWise that can help you use the data from the ListenWise platform to know how long students have listened and what skills they might need to work on and such. So those are just some examples of how you can help students prepare for tests, learn about the real world, stay engaged, use their voices by first starting with a podcast. So for listening strategies, I'm curious, in this slide, Jeff, we talked a little bit about the interactive transcript already. Love to hear more about your research on that and other kind of close listening practices.
Yeah, I mean, what I mostly have been focusing on the last couple of years, in addition to listening, but listening has been a big part of it, is what does it take to build up an idea as you're listening? So when you have either the interactive transcript, which actually can help you see what's being said as it's being said, but also there's a purpose to that. Right? There's a purpose for listening. So it's not just to listen. I mean, kids, they're not that interested in just listening to something, right? It needs to go beyond that, 5 to 10 minutes or however long the listening piece is, right? It needs to go beyond that. And so what is it going to take? And it's not just, this is similar to reading comprehension. What is it? We're still asking these questions. We're still learning a lot about, how do we help students integrate, the background knowledge that they have about whatever text they're listening to, plus the new stuff that they do listen to, and merge that together to build something useful that lasts in their mind, and not just for fun all the time. Sometimes it's just interesting, right? That's fine. But also, are they going to do something with it? Are they going to communicate later on in their own form? Are they going to create their own podcast? Right? Are they going to do something that that integrates that new information and that new language, and then use that language and that new information in some way afterwards? So that's kind of what I've been looking at recently.
Yeah, and I think with something like a close listening activity is what we call it on ListenWise, very similar to how you think of as a close reading, right? Giving them suggestions of maybe the first listen is just get the gist of the story. What's the main point? Maybe you do the second listen with the interactive transcript, and the third listen looking for particular vocabulary words, or just some suggestions of how to do that. And then chunking, as you just said, sort of, it's hard to listen to something as it goes on, but you as the teacher can have the power in the classroom to stop and chunk and check for understanding and have them record notes quietly, maybe to review at the end as a way to really get them more, you're really working their listening muscle. If you think about it like a muscle, you are not going to feed them a 1-hour lecture and expect them to be able to understand everything. So that's how I would think about it. And I think it's a good transition to explaining a little more about ListenWise. Type in the chat if you've heard of ListenWise. Give me a yes. But for those of you who haven't, ListenWise has more than 2,800 ready-made podcasts and lessons. So they are accompanied with easy-to-use resources, including an interactive transcript, note-taking, graphic organizers, an online quiz that just give you simple and strategies and resources to use around the listening to build your students' listening skills. And all the stories are selected to be aligned to the curriculum in science, social studies, and ELA, and they are also aligned to state standards. So it is a free resource for teachers for the majority of the collection, and many of the features we've talked about, and we'll talk about some more, are in the premium version, and you can get a free trial of that by going to listenwise.com. So I encourage you to sign up for free because, as I said, there's thousands of already screened, ready-to-go podcasts that you could be playing for your class tomorrow. And exciting, we've got some exciting additions to it by the fall. We're building more EL supports. So for the lower level speakers, we know listening can be particularly challenging. And listening alone, you need more visuals, you need more lower level, you need translation. So we're adding videos to build background. We're lowering the level of our quizzes, and we're adding Spanish translations to parts of that. So we're very, very excited about this new collection, and we can tell you more about that. Just go to listenwise.com. So, Jeff, let's transition now into talking a little more about these practical strategies. And this means also we're going to get to play some audio and talk about it. I guess I'll start by talking about some of the metacognitive strategies I've learned about just building listening skills, because before you get to the application of it in the classroom, you've got to think about what do students do during the listening. So with some simple practice and some good storytelling and these metacognitive strategies, we're confident your students' listening skills can improve. So one is directing their attention. So sharing with your students that, listening is a skill they can improve, and having them become aware of it as that, and know that their mind will wander when listening, but they need to direct their attention back to the task. You could use note-taking strategies. Talk to them about how listening is a constantly evolving task. And if they misunderstood something, they need to adjust based on what they've heard or make guesses. Planning. So you always want to set a goal for the listening. On ListenWise, we actually break it down to sort of before, during, and after, very specific things you should do, things you can assign online, graphic organizers you can print out. But most importantly, it's about creating a goal for the listening. As we were just talking about 3 strategies around listening, the goal could just be the first listen is, what is the gist of the story? And after listening, you can then assess with your learners whether or not they reach that goal. You can ask them to reflect and evaluate their own listening. That helps them also, again, realize that this is a skill that they control and they can improve. Finally, problem solving. Students are not going to know every word or concept they hear. In fact, we want their vocabularies to be stretched. And Fontes and Pinnell say that listening students, early grade listeners, can listen to texts at a higher grade level than they can read. So you expect that they won't understand every word that they hear. However, they need to be problem-solving listeners and guessing the meaning of the words to see if it makes sense. Tell them that's okay. Tell them they can use the overall idea of the story to help them understand words or concepts that they don't know. And that will make them problem-solving listeners. So I don't know if you have any other things to add on that, Jeff, is, good strategies around building, getting them ready for that listening, because we're going to next listen to a story together to sort of to illustrate this.
Well, I think back to the before, the during, and the after, it comes back to, like you said, the directed attention or the purpose for listening, right? And it's reminding kids, and it does take a lot of reminding, that we're doing this to help construct something bigger, to construct that idea in your head. And the note taking could just be, a list of notes, but you could also have a graphic organizer that is either a semantic map or something that kind of looks like a building. You're building up something, just to show kids this is part of our idea building. It's, we're going to listen to this next text, and your purpose is to add to something in your head. It's not just to build up vocabulary. That's going to happen. Some of these are kind of like side effects, and I don't want kids to simultaneously think they have to memorize 6 words out of this thing while they're also listening for, the actual content, right? I don't want them to do that. What happens in language development usually is we are trying to communicate, and over time, over lots of listening and lots of talking, and over time, our brain starts to use, what the best words and the best grammars for communicating or being communicated to. So that's where this would come in, thinking about this as, just a part of that building.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if we think about it in the context of a story I'm going to play, this idea of building vocabulary and language, or academic vocabulary as language, ListenWise has hundreds of really short stories that are fun and engaging and really pack a punch with the amount of academic language and that they have. They're called Weird News on the site, and we implemented using them because we know the biggest barrier that many English learners have to reclassification is developing their academic language and listening. So even a short passage can really help. And this story, what we do in every Weird News is have 2 vocabulary words highlighted to be listened to in context, but there are actually many more. You'll see 7 vocabulary words in this. But what I want you to do when we listen to this clip next is I want you to think about this question to answer following the podcast, and try to answer the questions using the vocabulary words. This is something we challenge students to do. Why do you think the dog traveled so far to lounge on a porch, and how do you think she got there? So let's listen to the audio.
Good morning, I'm Rachel Martin. Sometimes all you want is a familiar front porch. Maybe that's what was going through the mind of a yellow lab named Cleo when she traveled 60 miles to her family's old house in Lawson, Missouri. They moved out in 2018. The new residents recently came home to find Cleo lounging on the porch. She's since been reunited with her family at their current address. No one knows how she traveled those 60 miles, but it must be a really great front porch.
So as you can hear, really fun story, engaging audio, something the students are going to remember and hopefully relate to because they might have a dog or a pet. But how do you think the dog got there? And, how can you use that about using some of the words residence and traveled and lounging to answer that? And I think that you can put in the chat. I'd love to hear if you have thoughts in the chat of how you might use this as well, because that's just one suggestion. There are many ways to do that as well, beyond just this kind of conversation around using those words. But the idea, too, is you heard how short it was. You could easily play that a second time and be able to review, with your students. So the other thing that we talk about is during the listening, as we say, these instructional strategies. Jeff, you touched on this a little bit about ways to implement, what you're doing while you're listening, and what to do even after listening. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of these strategies?
Yeah, I mean, you've got, we don't have all the graphic organizers up there that you might want to use, but but often that's a way to organize, things that go pretty quickly, right? This is, some of you even in the chat mentioned, can you adjust the speed, right? And so in doing so, or listening to it 2 or 3 times, right, would help. And that would help get some of that language into you, and also give you some time. Like if I know that I'm going to fill some things in the graphic organizer, I might just want to listen and not write at the same time. And then I stop it, then I fill in something, and then I know I get another listen, right? And so I listen, and then I can look down at my notes and fill anything in, right, as it comes up. And as I do so, again, I'm building up this concept of whatever's happening. I mean, that was a pretty, that was a short text, but you still have a nice question that guides what you're going to write down. And you heard it beforehand, and you heard it after. And then if you look at the other, the conversations with peers, you could just say, turn to a partner and tell your partner what you think the answer is. And then you could do it again with a different partner after the second read, right? And so, there's a lot of variations for having kids use language and use it authentically. That's kind of something that I've been looking at lately, is how do I get kids to, say more than that bare minimum sentence that they think they have to say for points, rather getting into a topic, getting into an idea, answering a question that they want to answer, or they want to hear, they want to contribute to answering as a group with that in a conversation. And then the final, piece with the jigsaw, it's a little more complicated, but what's nice about it is you can have multiple texts, listening to let's say 2 or 4 different texts, and then you have something to share with your partner. So you didn't all listen to the same thing. So when you're talking to them, you're actually sharing something they haven't heard. They're going to be more interested, they're going to listen more, and you're going to talk more in that sort of information gap type activity.
Yeah, and we're going to share out a resource on this afterwards about designing structured choice activities with podcasts. It gives you some of these organizers to help out. And the question about slowing down is a really valid one, because we know that chunking and slowing information is helpful. ListenWise does have the ability to slow down the audio by 20%, and so do most podcasts that you find anywhere on the internet. It's become commonplace for you to be able to do that. What I think is really interesting about podcasts, and I came to really realize this by talking with you, Jeff, is around the types of language and text depending on the type of podcast. Like which audio is it makes a difference, right? And you hear different types of language in different types of audio. If you can talk a little bit about that to explain that, why it's important to have these mixed types in exposing students to a variety of language types.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have, it's similar to written text, right? You'll, but not exactly similar. But, when you've got let's say an expository text, maybe a scientific text, something that's been prepared and often read aloud from something that, has, that could be a written text, then you're going to get, different types of paragraph organization. You're going to get different types of transitions. You're often going to get longer sentences. Longer than what we are talking about right now, right? Because it's we're not really scripted. But then when you have for example, like a report, like the report we just heard, that's a little less, little less, they weren't reading from an academic type of script. So they weren't purposely making the sentences longer. There wasn't a lot of editing beforehand. And that would be similar to kind of a report, a news report, or any kind of unscripted text. And then, of course, the lecture often would fall under the academic piece, maybe not as many long sentences. And we've often heard people read, we know pretty quickly if someone's reading something, right? It's usually sounds, a little more, longer sentence, like perfectly placed transitions, that kind of thing.
Robotic. It can be robotic. And I'll interject here and I'll say that this is something that it bugs me a little bit as a radio reporter by nature and trade, because when you write for audio, it is different. It's very different in how you structure your sentences, where you put the emphasis, how the pausing works. And when someone reads a text written for print, it's a totally different syntax, and it's longer. The transitions there aren't contractions, or there are. It's very interesting. If you were to do an example of take a paragraph from a newspaper and play a little bit of a podcast on the same subject, and you realize how the podcast isn't exactly conversational language, but it isn't print. So these are very distinctive differences that make finding that authentic audio more important for your students to get exposure to.
Yeah, and there's probably going to be some experimentation. You can find out what they like to listen to, what kinds of text they, and in some cases you might say, hey, we're going to listen to a very difficult to understand, expository podcast here. Here's what we're going to do. So kind of just setting them up, right, for all these different types. Narrative versus expository, similar. The narrative text is going to be, in general, often a little more engaging, probably have less scientific language, maybe even some shorter sentences, right? Little easier to understand. But there's also some things we want them to think about as they're listening to this, this narrative. Maybe it's a story. A fictional story, and we want them to listen for certain markers that help them understand and help them navigate through the listening.
Yeah, that's a great segue to talking about a new way to gauge the difficulty of audio. So it was interesting to me that before 2020, when we worked with the Metametrics to create this Lexile framework for listening, there was not a way to level audio as you would text, and to say this piece of narrative is easier to listen to, or this conversation is easier to listen to than this expository lecture. And yet we all know some things are easier to listen to than others. So the Lexile framework for listening, which was released in early 2020, now allows us to know the difficulty of an audio passage and thus make the right choice for your students. And it's on a Lexile scale similar to the one that's used for reading. However, they are not parallel. Remember, I said research shows students can listen at a higher grade level than they can read. But there are many, many correlation studies that show listening comprehension affects reading comprehension. So the goal here with Lexile, and we've talked about this with them many times, is to eventually get a student listening level. Right now we have the audio measure. Let's measure the student and then see how that can compare to the reading. But right now, this is the information you can use about listening to monitor your students' growth over time and how to select the right passage for your students. And it takes into account 13 different variables, including grammar, syntax, vocabulary, and acoustic variables, pausing, speed rate, things that wouldn't surprise to you. So on ListenWise, we have, every podcast has this audio measure, and we have recommended grade level bands for the audio measure. And it's the only research-based measure that exists in education. And we're working on, for back to school, as part of these enhancements for English learners, to add recommendations for English learners. Right now it's based on grade level, and we want to make it more specific to English level learners. But I'm excited because I feel like this is a step toward reinforcing the importance of listening as it relates to reading and overall literacy. I think the other thing that can make listening and audio so powerful is this idea of culturally responsiveness. Reading Sims Bishop describes the power of literature to do this with windows, mirrors, and doors. And like other instructional texts, audio can do it as well. It can offer the same thing. So especially through listening, because you're hearing the voices of the people who are most affected, their primary sources. So students may find their experiences reflected and validated. They might better understand the experiences of others, and as if observing through a window, and they may, for a brief moment, feel like they're walking in someone else's shoes. So I'd love to play a little bit of what this sounds like from a ListenWise story. And we're going to be hearing a little bit from a story called Asian American Teens Reflect on Experiences of Prejudice. And we're going to jump right into hearing from some of them in their own words.
Thank you for being with us at a very important time. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Joyce, why don't we begin with you?
I'm very heartbroken by all of these attacks. Like, we see it being so normalized nowadays, and like, I fear for my family, my friends.
Yeah. Amanda Chen?
I personally try to avoid these news on my social media because it's so heavy, or like it's everywhere, happening constantly.
And Lily Zhang?
I agree. It's extremely heartbroken, and it's also very threatening to us, seeing how the Asians are being harassed, even in public. I just think it's not anymore could be considered a safe environment for all of us.
Jeff, how important do you think it is for English learners to hear versus read these kinds of perspectives?
Yeah, I mean, I think even just, I was kind of moved by listening to those voices, right? And I was also thinking about the fact that kids are very used to video, right? They might want to, like, well, where is the video? And I think it offers a great chance for, not just staring, but empathizing even more, because you're kind of just, you might be picturing these kids, you might not, but you might be picturing their emotions in a way. And so you're not as distracted by a video image, right? And so, I mean, even just listening to that, I was picturing listeners and teachers encouraging listeners to visualize, not necessarily just visualize the people, right, talking, but also visualize, what an emotion looks like, what their feelings. They mentioned three or four very powerful words, threatening, and they each kind of had a focal word they were emphasizing, and I think that's powerful. I think it's powerful to encourage kids to, be creative, to to create those images and visualize some abstract things that they're hearing in their heads. Not to mention hearing models of what they could share and produce, right, in terms of possibly creating their own podcast. So them seeing that, these are kids with voices. I have a voice as well, and I can communicate some of my ideas to others through that voice.
Yeah, that's excellent to think about it from that perspective. And research shows that listening builds empathy, especially when you're listening as a group. So if you were to play that out loud to the whole class, research shows that if you're all listening to the same thing, it builds empathy. And your point too about speaking and, coming out of that with an academic conversation, how that listening can lead to the next step, which is production. And I want to move on to that to talk a little bit about a strategy, Jeff, you have around stronger and clearer each time, and an approach that could take 4 different listening activities around a similar topic. And then how would you suggest teachers implement a stronger and clearer activity?
Yes, I mean, you see that there's like you said, a similar topic, 4 different texts. So I would group kids in a group of 4, and I would even have after they listened, I would have them stand up, and then that's when they would do the talking activity. But they would each listen separately. They would have their own text, like I mentioned, it's like a jigsaw, And then they might take notes on it. That's fine. I don't want them taking long notes and reading, to others through their partners, because that takes away from the personal, the eye contact and the conversational aspects. But once they have the text and they've taken their notes and they're ready, they share, the response to a question. It's not just here's a summary of what I listened to. I wanted to kind of answer a central question. And I don't know what the question, my eyes aren't good enough, but I could come up, you would come up with an interesting question based on these 4 texts. And then I would talk, in the group of 4, it'd be A, B, C, and D, and A and B would talk and C and D would talk. And they would try to answer that question, but referring to the text they listened to. They would hear the text, something from the text they didn't listen to, right, from their partner. And then they would also then maybe take a few notes before they switch to the next partner. And then it would be A and C would talk, right? And B and D would talk. So there'd be a second partnership. And I always encourage, I say it should be stronger and clearer, meaning you should have more ideas from your previous partner. And that partner should have helped you see where you were being clear or not, and in your language. And often it's harder to keep track of how clear you are, but usually you'll see that your message gets stronger each time. So each time at the end, you've shared your own 3 times, but you've heard 3 other kind of sets of ideas from your partners. And so this strategy has been very popular in a wide variety of ways. You could also do conversation lines, but I like the group of 4 because you have the 4 different texts.
Yeah, and another strategy you talk about is building this collaborative argument. So it's a little more advanced, right? Taking ideas and building off of them. This is an example of using Astoria that is a debate on ListenWise. How would you build a collaborative argument off of a podcast?
Well, the podcast would provide, the podcast, singular or plural, right, would provide some of the content. Usually what I'd have 2 kids do is after they've listened to a text or more than one text, they would start building up. They would brainstorm on the outside. I would point to the outside, like on the left side, what would be all the reasons and evidence that come from the text and from their own life, right? We're not just saying it has to just come from the text. And then they would put the strongest ones or the heaviest ones, heaviest arguments or reasons in, and it doesn't have to be 3 boxes. It could be 5, it could be 2, but this is just an example. And then after they've kind of decided, then they would do the same thing other side, right? They would, the opposing claim or position, in this case, the smartphone reasons for and against. And then you would after you've kind of populated each side of the scale, then you decide which side weighs more. So you could push back against some of the reasons that, like maybe there was a reason, a no on the no side that came from a not so great website, a very, suspect, that when you're losing critical literacy, this is not a very strong website here. So that they still might keep it up there, but they might say it's weaker because of that. So you'd push back on different reasons and then decide which side weighs more. You could also have that your partnership, your fill in the graphic partnership is your first partnership. Then you could switch partners and go to another partner and just take that visual with you and have a conversation with it. Because your first partner, you're just kind of filling in stuff, pushing back, that kind of thing, referring to text. But then you would have a little more of a conversation with that second partner because they did something different with their previous partner, and you would have a little bit more to share that might be different from that partner.
These strategies, make me think how they're dependent on a lot of talking, and that's great, conversation, and knowing whether somebody did understand something they heard if they make it stronger and clearer. But I think that can be time consuming. So I just want to point out that on ListenWise, we do have an easy way to quickly assess comprehension that can be done independently, individually, and that's using an auto-scored multiple choice listening quiz. We developed these because they didn't exist that we could find to be able to just know, did the student understand the main point? Could they understand a vocabulary word in context? And how do you know quickly that everybody's listened to the story and answered a few short questions to assess their listening skills? So this quiz comes with an auto-generated report that shows how each student did and how the whole class did based on the skills. The four main ones, again, are main idea, vocabulary, inferencing, and detail recall. So we're coming to the end of our time here. So I just want to remind you, we will be giving away a copy of my book, and we'll just select that from the list of attendees. And I know I peeked in the chat. We've got a lot of questions. I'm not sure we'll get to all of them, but I'll answer a few main points that came up. A couple people asked about whether ListenWise is free. ListenWise as a general resource is free for teachers with the collection of podcasts where you can listen to thousands of them and share the audio link and get listening, comprehension, and discussion questions for free. There is a paid premium that's for schools and districts or individual teachers. There's also opportunity for that you can trial for 30 days or longer. If you want to have a even longer district level pilot, we can arrange that. Just let me know in info@listenwise.com or monica@listenwise.com. But the idea is to, you can also find audio anywhere you get a podcast or your public radio. ListenWise helps you find them more easily and provides a lot more scaffolding for ELs in the paid service. So that was one of the questions that came up. Another one was about whether we have other translations in addition to Spanish. At this moment, we don't have a plan for that just yet, but we do hope to in the future. I mean, we know that in your classroom, there's, there are many, many different language speakers and many challenges. I guess what I would say is we do have a toolbar for students when the student is in their account, and that word can be, has a picture dictionary as well as Spanish translations and Spanish reading out loud. So as I'm looking through this, and I'm going to look through the questions a little more, but Jeff, I don't know if you want to give some concluding thoughts about this, listening and how it can help build good academic conversations.
Yeah, I mean, even beyond academic conversations, it depends on what you're interested in. But I think the power of listening is that you hear so many diverse ways of using language to communicate important things, right? And especially with these podcasts, there's just a wide variety of narrative and expository, of just different types of texts that quickly, right, instead of just handing these, all out to kids and, really almost kind of laboring through, even though I'm not saying that we still want them to read text, but this is a quick and efficient way to get language, basically to get and develop and to get kids interested in different ways of using language. And so that's how we grow their language. That's how we grow their content as well, is by really expanding the different ways that people are using language in the world. And I'm not saying, again, it's not just in English either. It's in every single language that we can imagine. And I know that's not all on ListenWise, but the more that they can listen to a wide variety of people using language, the better.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. I did answer a few of your questions in the chat, so if you put one in there earlier, take a look, see if you've got an answer. Really, I just hope you all have had your minds opened about how listening is a skill and a muscle that your students need to use and improve, and that will help them with their language skills as well as general reading comprehension and learning overall. So I want to really thank Dr. Zweirs for being with me today and sharing all of his expertise on this, and I hope you've learned some new strategies that you can use in your classroom tomorrow. So thank you all very much for attending.